Quand la réalité dépasse la fiction is the expression the French use to describe real-life events that seem so fantastical, they appear more far-fetched than the most surrealist of fictions. In English, the equivalent expression might be, you can't make this stuff up. But if you look at the Diab affair, they did make it up. They, whoever they are or were, made up the entire yarn with multiple strands of anti-Arab prejudice, and every bit of the narrative is as fantastical as it is far-fetched. In collaboration with foreign agents, French authorities wove a knotted fabric of fictions, lies, and unsworn statements, likely extorted through torture, in order to frame Hassan Diab, to scapegoat him, and thus bring closure to the mystery case of the 1980 Copernic attack, now more than 40 years old. In casting him as a scapegoat, as a shadowy stand-in for the real culprit, French authorities sought to appear successful in catching the bomber. Appear is the operative word here, for it signals an illusion that was manufactured to advance France's counter-terrorist cause and to subdue the victims' lobby with ceaseless calls for retribution. But if the Diab scapegoat surfaced as an expedient mechanism of psychological and political displacement, he had first to be fabricated, afforded a true-to-life character that, to some, at least, he would resemble the real bomber. To be clear, the Diab scapegoat is not a real human being. He is an imaginary persona, a structure of thinking, and those who created this mysterious figure were practicing a politics of distraction, intended to catch public opinion in a web of deceit. Indeed, the entire story that was spun between 1980 and 1999, it took 19 years, and that formed the basis of France's wrongful 2023 verdict, was a red herring writ large. The result was a low-grade detective story that is as incoherent and shape-shifting as it is fallacious. In its earliest iteration, 2008 more or less, the story they hatched claimed that Diab traveled to France by train via Spain in order to carry out an attack on Paris's Copernic synagogue. But after 2018, once Diab's alibi came to light, demonstrating that at the time of the bombing he was in Beirut studying for exams, the story had to be adjusted. In that new version of the story, in 2021, Diab was said to have traveled to Paris by plane. He then, it was argued, returned speedily to Beirut just in time to sit the exam. There is no evidence for either of these James Bond-like scenarios. Still, the prosecution's 2023 version circles back to the incoherent first rendition, in which Diab is said to have traveled to Paris by train via Spain. But, as the French investigative magistrate Jean-Marc Herbeau stated when questioned at the 23 trial, you can't have it both ways. Either Diab went by train or by plane, but not both. A close look at the narrative and its various incarnations reveals a plethora of contradictions, distortions, and unsolved questions. Indeed, the scrupulous work of two French investigative magistrates has illuminated these flagrant discrepancies, underscoring the speciousness of France's anti-Diab tale. Thanks to these two magistrates, Jean-Marc Herbeau and Richard Folzer, Diab's innocence was irrefutably demonstrated in 2018. On January 12th of that year, Jean-Marc Herbeau ordered Diab's release, and with that move, he rendered void the accusatory fiction spread against Diab by French counter-terrorist authorities. If the story that forms the basis of France's verdict is inconsistent in its substance, it is nonetheless consistent in its pattern of occlusions, in its denial of the indisputable evidentiary material. Diab's fingerprints were taken, as he just said, 10 times between 2008 and 2015, and they never matched those of the alleged bomber. And precisely because of this powerful exculpatory evidence, prosecutors went to extraordinary lengths to fabricate inculpatory material in order to bury the inconvenient truth of Diab's innocence. All those actors who sought Diab's prosecution knowingly suppressed, obscured, denied, or stamped out exculpatory evidence. There are 4 major instances in which this burial of evidence occurred, and on which I rest my case. 1, when France presented its record of the case to Canada in 2008. 2, when Canadian Crown attorneys abetted the extradition of Diab to France between 2008 and 2011. 3, When France's appeals court in 2021 reversed the 2018 release order that freed Diab from France's maximum security prison, and 4, when the Cour d'Assize tried Diab in absentia in April of 2023. I call each of these instances conjunctures, and I start with conjuncture 1. On November the 13th, 2008, Diab was arrested. The RCMP took his fingerprints. The latter were sent to France for comparison with the prints of the alleged bomber. On November the 19th, France's investigative magistrate, Marc Trévédic, received a report indicating that Diab's prints did not match those of the bomber. Trévédic did not share this fingerprint comparison evidence with his Canadian counterpart. He mulled over this discomforting news for a few days and decided to omit this fingerprint evidence in the certified record of the case that he submitted to Canada on December the 11th, 2008. Citing a 1980 and thus outdated French police document, which stated that there were no exploitable fingerprints on the hotel card that the bomber had signed, Trévédic dissembled. He used an anachronistic document to conceal his omission of key exculpatory evidence. But as CBC David Cochrane has written, court documents show that France, notably Trévédic's predecessor, a guy named Bruguière, was able to find a usable fingerprint on the hotel card in May of 2007, 19 months before the extradition request was made. Having falsified the certified record of the case in December of 2008, Trévédic, it would seem, had committed perjury on 2 counts. 1, he omitted the results of fingerprint analysis that excluded Diab, and 2, he denied that there were any usable fingerprints. With this deceitful maneuver, he was knowingly pursuing the wrong man, and everything that he submitted in the record of the case to Canada could only have been a tissue of falsehoods. Trévédic's double lie to Canada was only disclosed in 2018 by 2 honorable French investigative magistrates, Jean-Marc Herbeau and Richard Folzer. But France never corrected its false statement and thus misled the Canadian Superior Court of Justice, the Court of Appeal for Ontario, and the Supreme Court of Canada. This first suppression of exculpatory evidence is to be attributed to France, the second to Canada. I turn to the extradition process now to make this plain. We're now at conjuncture 2. Legal scholars such as Rob Curry and Gary Botting have established that Canada's defective extradition law overrides Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. For one, it presumes the requesting state to be reliable. In this, it allows false evidence to be taken at face value as justification to extradite the person sought. The Diab case illustrates this well. False evidence from France was used to send Diab to purgatory in a maximum security prison. He languished there for more than 3 years without charge. But it was not only the law that facilitated this unjust extradition, it was also the agents of the law who proactively sought this expulsion. Canadian officials in the Department of Justice actively propped up the French extradition case, delaying court procedures and withholding vital information. Thus, in November of 2009, they requested a comparative analysis of fingerprints. In early 2010, the RCMP produced the analysis. The fingerprints did not match. The Crown attorneys would have known this throughout the extradition hearing, yet they never shared the information with the defense or showed it to the Canadian judge who made the extradition order. Meanwhile, these Crown attorneys regularly exchanged memos with their French counterparts, pushing for and obtaining court delays until the French authorities could find a smoking gun, one that would guarantee Diab's extradition. What was this smoking gun? Flimsy handwriting evidence discredited fully by 5 international experts and later by French experts themselves. Still, this same repudiated handwriting evidence served as a red herring to distract from the hard scientific fingerprint proof of Diab's innocence, proof that France and Canada sought to conceal at all costs. For a decade, France sequestered possession of fingerprint evidence that would have refuted allegations against Diab. And for 8 years, Canadian government officials also knew that Diab's fingerprints did not match those of the suspected bomber. They withheld this fact from the court, acting underhandedly to abet a French extradition request that was tainted from the outset. Conjuncture 3. In 2021, the French Court of Appeal also attempted to occlude Diab's exculpatory evidence, and they did so with a preposterous argument dubbed the careful bomber theory. With this fanciful claim, they speculated that the bomber took extra care not to leave any trace of fingerprints on the hotel registration card that he signed. Such sophistry recalls Trevedick's mendacious claim that there were no usable fingerprints to exploit, even as comparative fingerprint analyses took place at least 10 times between 2008 and 2015. Conjuncture 4, the trial. During the 2023 trial, a version of this careful bomber theory took on an even more risible form when an ex-police officer unrelated to the Diab case testified that in the 1980s there was a police policy that forbade the suspect from touching the paper on which he signed his name. I think Don mentioned that one. With this fantastical tale, the court categorically averted all mention of Diab's exculpatory evidence. In the same thrust, it turned the public's attention to a doctored-up facsimile of a lost passport and called this theatrical prop the smoking gun. The 2023 trial of Hassan Diab, held in a court of no record, was a sham, a display of scandalous deceit. Documented fingerprint analysis, which had excluded Diab from the crime of Copernic, was clearly the elephant in the living room, the all too obvious element that prosecutors in 4 major instances sought to quash. And ironically, that suppression of exculpatory evidence occurred most blatantly in a judicial context, where the law purports to serve justice. But the law is a tool, not the actualization of justice, and those who wield that tool do so with political intent. In the Diab case, magistrates, crown attorneys, and judges played fast and loose with the law. It is imperative, then, that we do our utmost to hold them accountable. Indeed, the exposure of their crimes is central to the liberation of our long-suffering but most admirable fellow Canadian, Hassan Diab. The mental torment to which he and his family have been subjected for more than 15, now more than 16 years, is beyond egregious. It must come now to an end with our government's publicly stated response to France: no second extradition for Dr. Diab.